What's a sign of someone who is really dumb or lacks intelligence? Story 1. One time, a guy called me at the IT help desk, panicked because his monitor wasn't working. I asked if it was plugged in. He swore it was. After a few minutes of back and forth, I suggested checking the cable again. He sighed, put the phone down, and came back with, "Okay, yeah, it wasn't plugged in." Then he added, "But why would it come unplugged in the first place? Shouldn't it stay in there?" I had no words. Story 2. My mom still calls me every time she wants to watch a DVD because she doesn't know how to switch the input on the TV. I've explained it at least 50 times, but every time she acts like it's some advanced coding. Meanwhile, she can FaceTime me, send gifts, and order groceries online without batting an eye. Story 3. There was a guy at work who kept trying to fix his jammed office printer by aggressively pressing random buttons. After a few minutes of angry beeping, he threw up his hands and yelled, "Technology is so stupid!" Someone walked over, opened the paper tray, and removed the jammed sheet. Problem solved in 10 seconds. The guy said, "Well, it should have told me to do that." Story 4. I once had a co-worker in her early 50s who refused to learn anything new when it came to the computer software we used daily. One time, I tried showing her how to do a simple calculation in Excel using equal sign sum. She waved me off, saying, "Oh, I'm too old for that, sweetie. You do it for me." I thought, okay, fine, until I saw her later that day using her iPad to map out a 12-stop road trip itinerary while booking hotels and tours online. I was dumbfounded. She had no problem figuring out advanced travel planning tools, but God forbid she clicks on a formula in Excel. It wasn't just about age or capability, it was sheer refusal to try because she'd decided office tasks were someone else's job. The kicker? She used to get defensive when I suggested learning these skills, saying, "I didn't grow up with this stuff." Sure, maybe not, but last I checked, neither did most people working today. Story 5. When I worked at support, I once had a caller who said their monitor wasn't working. I asked a few basic questions. Was the screen black? Were the cables plugged in? "I don't know, that's why I called you," they snapped. So I had them check the back of the monitor, only for them to discover they'd accidentally kicked the power strip unplugged. Problem solved, right? Wrong. A week later, the same person called about their computer breaking down. This time, they hadn't turned it on. When I asked if the power button light was on, they acted offended, like I was calling them stupid for not knowing where the power button was. I even heard them mutter, "Tech people think they're so smart," while fumbling around. By the end of the call, I was drained. Not because they didn't know something, but because they didn't want to learn. Fix it, forget it, and call again when the next minor inconvenience arises. Story 6. There's this guy at work who, no joke, proudly brags about never reading books. Once, during a slow afternoon, someone suggested trivia to kill time. I was excited, thinking it'd be fun, until the guy couldn't name all the planets in the solar system. He just laughed it off, saying, "I'm not a nerd like some people." That would have been fine if it was just a joke, but then another coworker chimed in, saying they didn't see the point of reading either. I remember sitting there stunned as the two of them bonded over how sad it was to spend weekends with a book. The irony? They couldn't answer half the trivia questions, but insisted they were smart enough for real life. Moments like that make me appreciate my bookshelf more than ever. Story 7. My grandma, who's 86, learned how to use Uber because she was tired of waiting on family to give her rides. Meanwhile, my 40-something uncle once spent 20 minutes complaining that he didn't know how to install an app. She looked at him and said, "It's not hard, you just follow the instructions." He looked like he'd been personally attacked. Story 8. I had a coworker once who was the epitome of stubbornness. She wasn't particularly old, in her late 40s, but she had this mentality that anything involving technology was beneath her. She'd openly brag about how she didn't bother with computers and made a point of refusing to learn anything new. Our office used a standard suite of programs for emails, spreadsheets, and scheduling, and most of us picked it up within a week. Not her. If she couldn't figure something out, she'd just pass it off to someone else with a cheery, "You're so much better at this than me." At first, I didn't mind helping her. It's always nice to lend a hand, but then it became a pattern. She'd leave tasks unfinished until someone else picked up the slack. One day, I tried to show her how to use a basic feature in Excel, and she flat out refused, saying, "Oh, I didn't grow up with computers like you kids." I wanted to point out that Excel has been around since the mid-'80s, and she wasn't exactly ancient, but I held my tongue. What finally broke me was when she asked me to fix a computer issue that turned out to be her not knowing how to open an email attachment. I showed her how, thinking she'd want to learn, but instead she said, "Great, now I know who to call when this happens again." It wasn't just the ignorance, it was the pride she took in it. I've never understood people who wear their refusal to learn like a badge of honor, as if it makes them more authentic or relatable. To me, it just makes them harder to work with. Story 9. A coworker once called IT because his keyboard stopped working. After some troubleshooting, they realized he had spilled coffee on it. His solution? He flipped it over, shook it out, and said, "It's fine, I dried it." It handed him a new keyboard and told him not to drink near it anymore. 2 days later, he did it again. Story 10. There's this guy in my office, let's call him Dan, who absolutely refuses to troubleshoot even the simplest issues. Dan is in his late 20s, smart enough to do his job well, but when it comes to problem solving, it's like his brain just shuts off. Once he called IT because his computer mouse wasn't working. When they asked if he'd checked the batteries, he said, "Why would I do that? Isn't that what you're for?" Turns out the batteries were dead, and they replaced them in about 30 seconds. Then there was the time he couldn't log into one of his accounts. He stormed into my office saying his computer was broken. I asked a couple of basic questions. Was he sure he was typing the right password? Did he check to see if the caps lock was on? He sighed dramatically and said, "I don't know. I just do the same thing every day, and it's supposed to work." I went over to his desk, and sure enough, the caps lock was on. I fixed it in 2 seconds, and instead of saying thank you, he muttered, "This stuff is so stupid. Why can't they make it easier?" The icing on the cake was the day he couldn't connect to the office Wi-Fi. Instead of checking the router or asking anyone nearby, he submitted a help desk ticket marked urgent. It came up, looked at his computer, and discovered that he'd accidentally turned off the Wi-Fi switch on his laptop. When they explained this to him, he just shrugged and said, "Well, that's not my job to know." It's not that Dan lacks intelligence. He's just completely unwilling to take 5 seconds to think for himself. It's maddening to watch. Story 11. My ex was one of those people who prided himself on ignorance. He'd boast about dropping out of high school, saying it was proof you don't need fancy schooling to succeed. At first I thought it was just bravado, but then I realized he genuinely believed knowledge was overrated. Once we were watching the news, and I casually mentioned how a new technology was inspired by NASA's research. He scoffed and said, "NASA's just a scam to waste taxpayer money." When I tried to explain the science behind it, he rolled his eyes and said, "I don't need to know that nerd crap to get by." It was infuriating. He had no curiosity, no drive to understand anything outside his tiny bubble. To him, being uninformed wasn't a flaw, it was a badge of honor. Story 12. I volunteer at a local theater where most of the team is retired. One thing I've noticed is how differently people approach the ticket scanner we use. Some volunteers, even in their 70s and 80s, jump at the chance to use it, joking about how it feels like being in a sci-fi movie. They're quick to learn and even help troubleshoot when it beeps the wrong way. Others, though? They flat out refuse to touch it. "Too complicated," they say, as if it's some alien device. What baffles me is that these same people have no problem using smartphones to share pictures of their grandkids or order groceries online. The ones who embrace the scanner are always happier and more engaged, while the others sit there complaining about how technology ruined everything. Seeing that contrast has been a huge eye-opener for me. When I'm their age, I want to be the person scanning tickets, not the one avoiding them. Story 13. Back when I was working for a corporate help desk, I got a call from a VP who was freaking out because their laptop wasn't charging. This person was known for their temper, so I braced myself and started asking basic troubleshooting questions. "Is the charger plugged into the laptop?" I asked. "Yes, of course it is," they snapped. "I'm not an idiot." After about 10 minutes of walking them through other potential issues, I suggested they double-check the USB-C connection. "Fine," they huffed. Then there was silence. Finally they said, "Oh, it wasn't fully plugged in." They laughed it off, but I could tell they were embarrassed. It wasn't the mistake that bugged me. It was the assumption that it couldn't possibly be something simple, coupled with the complete lack of willingness to try checking before calling me. When I hung up, all I could think was, some people are too important in their own heads to even plug in a cable. Story 14. My mom is in her early 60s and still asks me to fix the TV every time she switches inputs to play a DVD or use her Blu-ray player. She's been doing this for years now, even though it's literally just pressing the input button and scrolling down. One day, after explaining it for the 100th time, I asked why she couldn't just learn it. Her response? "I don't need to learn because you're here to do it for me." That stung more than I expected. It wasn't that she couldn't learn, it was that she didn't want to. The same woman who mastered streaming services on her tablet and figured out how to send me GIFs in text messages couldn't bother to remember a single button on the remote. Sometimes it feels like she uses "too old to learn" as a crutch, but really it's just an excuse. Story 15. Back in college, I had a professor who was notorious for shutting down questions. His lectures were dense and confusing, and half the class usually looked lost. But every time someone raised their hand to ask for clarification, he'd roll his eyes and say something like, "That's not what we're discussing right now," or "You should already know this." One day, I stayed after class to ask about a topic I just couldn't wrap my head around. He looked at me like I was wasting his time and said, "Maybe you're in over your head with this subject." That comment stuck with me, and not in a good way. I ended up dropping the class because it was clear I wasn't going to learn anything from him. Years later, I ran into him at a conference, and he looked genuinely surprised to see me. We started chatting, and he asked what I was working on. When I told him I was finishing my PhD in a related field, his jaw practically hit the floor. I didn't bring up our past interactions, but I wanted to. It wasn't just his arrogance that bothered me back then. It was how he made people feel like asking questions was a weakness. That experience taught me that real intelligence isn't about knowing everything. It's about staying curious and helping others learn. Story 16. I used to have a manager who constantly ignored new processes, insisting on doing things the way we've always done them. Once we had a meeting about streamlining a reporting system that saved hours of work each week. Everyone was on board except her. She pushed back hard, saying, "We've gotten this far doing it my way, so why change now?" I tried explaining how the updated method would be more efficient, but she shut me down, claiming it was too complicated. A month later, I found out she had never even tried the new system. Her refusal to adapt ended up costing the company thousands of dollars in wasted time. Watching her dig her heels in and actively resist improvement taught me that stubbornness isn't strength, it's a liability. Story 17. My grandmother, bless her heart, is in her mid-80s and has always been one of the most curious people I know. A few years ago, after her eyesight started failing, she decided she needed a smartphone to make her life easier. She wanted to FaceTime her grandkids, order groceries, and keep up with her friends on Facebook. The rest of the family wasn't so sure. They thought it would be too much for her to handle, but she was determined. I spent a weekend teaching her the basics: how to text, use voice commands, and navigate apps. She asked a million questions, took notes in this little notebook, and practiced every step until she got it right. Flash forward a few months, and she was a pro. She figured out how to use Uber without any help and even set up a Pinterest account to save recipes. Meanwhile, my mom, who's 25 years younger, still refuses to learn how to use her Blu-ray player. Every time I visit, She asks me to switch the TV input for her, saying, "I'm too old to keep up with this stuff." It drives me crazy. If my grandmother can learn to FaceTime at 85, why can't my mom push a single button? It's not about age or ability. It's about attitude. My grandmother approaches technology like an adventure, while my mom treats it like a chore. Watching the two of them has taught me a lot about how much mindset matters. If you stop learning, you don't just fall behind, you get stuck. Story 18. There's a guy I work with who refuses to troubleshoot even the smallest issues. Once his computer mouse stopped working, and instead of checking if the batteries were dead, he just yelled across the office, My mouse is broken!" I went over, popped the back off, and swapped the batteries. Problem solved. You'd think he'd be grateful, but instead he said, "I don't know why they make these things so cheap now. They should work forever." Another time his keyboard stopped responding, and rather than rebooting his computer, he submitted a help desk ticket. It showed up, pressed one key, and it worked fine. I honestly think he sees solving problems as someone else's responsibility. It's not about intelligence. It's laziness wrapped in entitlement. Story 19. When I was in college, I had a professor who would shut down anyone who asked questions in class. His attitude was basically, if you don't understand it, that's your problem. It created this weird atmosphere where nobody wanted to speak up, even when they were lost. One day I went to his office hours to ask about a concept I'd been struggling with, and he straight up told me, "Some people just aren't cut out for this subject." That was the last straw. I dropped the class, and I wasn't the only one. Years later, I ran into him at a conference, and he seemed genuinely confused about why his students never excelled. I wanted to tell him that his arrogance and lack of empathy were the problem, but I just walked away. Some people are so blind to their flaws, they can't even see when they're the reason for failure. Story 20. My 85-year-old grandmother is one of the most independent people I know. A few years ago, she started getting frustrated with relying on family to drive her around. She hated feeling like a burden, so she decided to learn how to use Uber. At first, we thought it was just talk. How was someone her age going to figure out a smartphone app? But she surprised all of us. She spent hours fiddling with her phone, watching tutorial videos on YouTube, and asking questions until she got it. The first time she ordered an Uber, she called me afterward, absolutely thrilled. "It was so easy," she said, like a kid showing off a new toy. Meanwhile, my uncle, her 60-year-old son, can't figure out how to download an app to save his life. He's constantly asking for help with the simplest tasks, from resetting his email password to figuring out how to send a photo. His excuse? They didn't teach us this stuff in school. Watching the two of them side by side is such a stark contrast. My grandmother, who grew up without electricity for part of her life, has embraced technology with open arms, while my uncle, who's been around computers for decades, acts like they're impossible to understand. It's not about age. It's about attitude. My grandmother's willingness to learn has kept her sharp and independent, while my uncle's refusal to adapt has made him completely reliant on others. Story 21. My neighbor is the kind of person who scoffs at book smarts and brags about learning everything the hard way. One time he came over asking for help with his taxes. I tried showing him an online tool that would save him a ton of time and money, but he waved it off, saying, "I don't trust those things." Instead, he spent days filling out forms by hand, making multiple mistakes along the way. When I asked why he didn't want to try the easier option, he said, "I don't need no fancy software to figure out my own money." The irony? He ended up owing more because of an error he could have avoided with the tool. It's like he takes pride in making things harder for himself, as if that somehow makes him smarter. Story 22. I'll never forget one of the most bizarre tech support calls I ever had. This guy was furious when he called, saying his computer wouldn't work and demanding that I fix it immediately because he had an important meeting in 5 minutes. I started asking basic troubleshooting questions, like if the computer was powered on. His response? "Of course it's on. I'm not an idiot." Okay, I thought, moving on. I asked him to describe what he was seeing on the screen. He got quiet for a second before saying, "The screen is black." I asked, "Is the monitor plugged in and powered on?" He sighed like I just asked him to solve a physics equation and snapped, "That's your job to figure out." Eventually, I had him check the back of the monitor, and wouldn't you know it, the cable was hanging loose. He plugged it back in, and the screen lit up instantly. Most people would laugh at themselves in that situation, but not this guy. He muttered something about how technology should just work, and hung up without a thank you. A week later, he called back about a similar issue. This time, the monitor wouldn't turn on at all. I walked him through checking the power strip, and guess what? He'd accidentally turned it off while moving some furniture. After fixing it, I tried explaining how he could avoid this in the future, but he cut me off saying, "Look, I don't need a lecture." It wasn't that he lacked intelligence. He just refused to take 2 seconds to think or learn. The irony? He worked in a field where problem-solving was literally his job. Story 23. A few years back, I worked at a small theater where most of the volunteers were retirees. There were 2 kinds of people on the team: those who embraced the ticket scanner and those who avoided it like it was radioactive. The scanner wasn't even complicated. It was a small handheld device, basically a barcode reader. The scanner crew were always upbeat, cracking jokes and chatting with customers while they scanned tickets. They loved learning how the technology worked and often helped troubleshoot when it acted up. Then there were the avoiders. They'd cross their arms and say things like, "That's not my job," or "I don't do tech stuff." One woman refused to even try, claiming she was too old to learn, even though she was younger than some of the scanner crew. She'd sit at the info desk, grumbling about how kids these days rely too much on gadgets. One day we had a big event, and everyone needed to help with scanning. I offered to show her how to use the scanner, but she snapped, "I don't have time for that," and walked off. It was frustrating, but also kind of sad. The scanner crew always seemed happier and more connected, while the avoiders just looked miserable. It really drove home the idea that staying curious and open to learning makes a huge difference, not just in how you handle technology, but in how you approach life.